I mean, like that I cannot write or stuff. That I can do. But to set my mind and compose a story, coherent story and stuff, and make it attractive for reading, to keep people mind. Well, I don't think I'm going to do
Just said it was
Yeah, I don't know if that was just convenience. Often I'm looking at Martin.
I mean, I didn't know the history. It's why it ended up read-only.
Hey, Andy, I'll get some of today. I'm gonna take it.
Send the data wire every time. Every time.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to SUPA, the final session of IETF 95. And well done for actually making it this far and staying around actually as well. So that's good. Just looking around, double checking, actually, we've got all of our presenters here. So I think that's good. So please pay close attention to the note well. I believe most of you should know this fairly well now. Although it is going through an update that hasn't actually been given to us as it's not a formal change. So if you're attending SUPA for the first time, you may want to pay some attention to the charter or even look actually at the previous IETF 94, our inaugural SUPA working group session. There's some documentation there that sort of defines the scope, the general direction of SUPA. We have clearly a mailing list. Now, I would like to address some housekeeping items. The first is a minute taker. We already had one volunteer. Can I make sure that they're still willing to do that? Will, are you okay to take some minutes for the session?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay, great. And if anyone wants to assist Will, that would be appreciated. Will, would you prefer to take them offline or use Etherpad and have some collaborative support?
Here is that online. I'm sorry, because the end of the network starts.
Right, so that's the technical term to describe the network quality. The next request then, assuming we have connectivity, is Jabber. Do we have a Jabber scribe? Neville will be in the Jabber room. Okay, thank you, Sue. Yeah, so if we can just channel any questions. We already had at least, well, we've got sort of 7 or 8 people in the room at the moment. We've got 3 on Meet Echo, so that's good. Blue sheets have started to circulate the room. Please make sure that you sign the blue sheets by the end of the session. We'll double check during the session to see where they are and if anyone hasn't signed them yet. So this is going to be a fairly short session. It's 1 hour. We felt that we could focus on the various milestone items. We had, I think, 2.5 hours at the previous IETF, and we didn't actually use up all the time, and some of the discussion wasn't sort of as well directed as we might have done. So this time we just wanted to kind of be clear about what the priority work items are, And then if there's time at the end of the session, then we can have some sort of additional documents, any other items that you want to discuss. So, what is our priority list at the moment? Well, this is driven by our charter and specifically our milestones, and watched very carefully by our boss, our area director. And if you've been following the mailing list discussion, we didn't have a lot of discussion sort of immediately after IETF 94, and it wasn't really until Neville started discussing and potentially put the information model up for working group adoption that we suddenly generated all of this chatter. And that's been great, because it's important to show actually that the working group is making progress, and this is open participation. And although some of you may be having lots of discussion offline, it's really important that we show some of this discussion online, especially when we want to be inclusive. And if you have any open issues or questions, feel free to sort of post those on the list and get additional feedback and data points. So we've got the information model to start with on the agenda, then our data model. Thank you, Joel, for presenting that. John's going to present the information model. We've got Dacheng's applicability document, but Dacheng's not here. And we've got, who's presenting? You, okay, great, thank you. And then at the end of the current work item section of today's meeting, we've got a discussion on the framework and the architecture document. We saw 2 individual drafts submitted this week. I think these were both posted on the mailing list. So the intention at this session, at least, isn't to dig into or discuss those particular documents. It's really to talk about sort of the direction of the work. I know that the 2 sets of authors have been having various meetings during the week. I've attended some of those discussions, interactions. I don't think there's too much blood spilt, but they were certainly heated. So I think we've got some more work that we need to do there. Okay. So does anyone have any agenda requests or changes? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I think we've covered all of the working group status, haven't we, since last IETF? Okay, so John, can we have you up?
Hi, my name is John Strassner, and I'm going to try and be very quickly through the information model and show you what I'm joking so far. The motivation for the information model is primarily 2 things. First, policy spans multiple different actors. There's business people, there's network admins, there's application developers, there's lots of people in between those. And what we want from an information model is a
oops. Sorry about that, everyone.
Oh, it gets even louder. Wow.
Yeah, that's a surprise, right, Bert? My typical, sorry, software guy, hardware problems, so I screwed up. Do I need to repeat all that? Thank you. So given that policy spans all of these different actors, what do? Because the business person doesn't want to see CLI, and the network admin doesn't want to see fluffy, statements that don't have any technical thing that they can program. So we need some type of way to deal with these different abstractions that corresponds to a common vocabulary, which is why you build information models. And even if our target is just Yang, and as far as I know, unless the chairs correct me, are the target of this group is to produce Yang data models, there's still a lot of leeway in there, right? If you look at some of the Yang drafts that have policy is expressed multiple different ways. So the hope is that SUPA can be used as a normalization mechanism to get some consistency here. So next, main changes. There is a draft that is currently in Kate, my computer. We haven't posted it yet because, gee, I wanted feedback from the group. But the main proposed changes in this new draft is much like a poor blue Norwegian parrot that was found pining for its fjords. The declarative model has ceased to be. Everything in this draft that I've got about declarative is gone, okay? And there's a number of reasons for that, but the main thing is we felt that since the draft is long and in a better way to focus on just the imperative part, we've simplified this. Joel and I have made more than one round trip from the information model to the data model and then back to the information model. And that has resulted in some clarifications and a simplification of some of the relationship multiplicities. And so once we fix a somewhat embarrassing extraction problem, apologies Benoit, and one must statement, we have come up with an interesting way to take an object-oriented information model and build at least a semi-object oriented Yang model, and Joel will talk to you more about that. And of course, the inevitable typos, etc. So how do we do this? If you look at this class hierarchy, then there are two hierarchies. One is SUPA policy object, that's for policy rules and components. One is SUPA policy metadata, that's for the metadata that augments the policy rules and components of policy rules. SUPA policy structure is for the completed policy rule. SUPA policy component structure is a superclass for building up clauses that make up the SUPA policy rule. And we've given you a number of different options to do that. Every single one is optional. So if you don't like the canonical form of variable operator value, don't use it, right? It's not mandatory. It's there as a set of Lego building blocks for your convenience. The somewhat cool thing is, from an implementation point of view, we've used software patterns, and the most important is this decorator pattern, which allows an object or part of an object, like an attribute or a method, to wrap another object. This is done very commonly. For example, Java's I/O package does this. And that allows you to change the object model and the data model at runtime without having to take down the database and redeploy and blah, blah, blah. So this is kind of a cool model. Same thing in the ECA policy rule information model. And you'll notice that these new classes always derive from an existing class. How did I do that? You're just fooling with me. And I even gave the dead parrot sketch, and that's the respect I get. Jeez. Okay, so if we want to build an ECA policy rule, it's derived from something in the generic policy information model. If we want to build Boolean clauses, that's derived from something in the generic policy information model. there's nothing in here that is not derived from the generic policy information model. And with that, obviously, feedback is always welcome. In the meantime, the chair's issued a working group call for adoption, and that's really all I have to say. Questions? Going once. Benoit.
Benoit Claes, can you hear me? Good. So speaking as a contributor, this morning I was reviewing the mailing list and the email thread on the call for adoption. So thanks, Neville, for generating some energy on the mailing list. And it seems that with this question, we try to answer actually two different questions. The first one, is this good work to help with the data model? And the second one is, should we publish it? And I've seen arguments actually trying to answer both of them, right? Mm-hmm. And these are two different questions. The charter says that if the working feels like it, they might work an information model and will to derive data models, and we'll see in the end whether we want to publish this. So maybe we want to distinguish those, because what I've seen also is people telling, I would like to have an architecture to see how it fits, to see if it's good work. Myself only to see the Yang data model to see if it was good work. Some people mentioning, I would like to have the full life cycle of IAM, DM implementation, DM update, IAM update, etc. So maybe this is what we want to do here and just try to answer, is it good work to derive data model? Yes, no. And do we publish? Which is maybe in the end, whenever we're ready for everything, that we decide what to do with it from a publication point of view.
I completely agree. It's good advice. Anyone else? Joel, wherever you are. Oh, there you are. He was hiding. Thank you.
So the chairs have a couple of questions. Sorry, John. So the first is, who has read this document? Okay, and why aren't you talking on the mailing list? Why aren't you asking questions on the mailing list? Okay, we've got at least one set of questions.
And in fact, in -05 and -06, a lot of Bert's very useful comments we've incorporated. -05, I forgot to acknowledge you. I'm sorry. -06, I fixed that, but we appreciate the feedback.
Okay, that's great. So thank you very much for reading the document. The second question would be, who thinks of the people that have read the document and who just raised their hands, could you raise your hands if you think the document would be a good start as an information model if we decided actually to adopt this as a working group item, which is under consideration? Okay, that's good. Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Joel Halpern from Ericsson and have worked very extensively with John Strassner on this data model. The challenge was to take the information model with its associations and inheritance and everything else and make a valid Yang data model out of it so we can use it. All of the semantics in the data model document are derived from the information model, which is why when we got short of time, we didn't put in all of the full descriptions. There should be more description in there. I'm not saying that's right. We can work out how much. There should be more, but for the working group's purposes now for understanding, it is a perfect mirror in terms of semantics. So if you go, what is this piece? You can awkwardly look at the information model document to get that. We had to render classes, inheritance, relationships with cardinalities, and association classes. And we're not the first people to do this, and I went and looked at some of the other drafts that have been written about how to map UML to Yang, and then found, well, that draft doesn't tell me what I needed to know, and then went to the Yang doctors and said, can I do this or this? And various different people helped us find a way to do this. So for classing and subclassing, we actually did two things. And Martin, I can't pronounce his last name, suggested the use of the identities to me. And That's a nice trick and helps us with a number of concepts because identities in Yang have based on, so they have an inheritance tree of their own. So we use identities to name what kind of thing we are talking about. Principally, I mean, you don't need them, but they allow us to say easily, when we're referencing something else, it is supposed to be of this class or a subclass thereof. So that's what we use identities for. And then each class is also a grouping because uses is sort of like inheritance. And so when you define a subclass, the first thing in the subclass is uses the parent class. And so that's the technique we use. So the top level classes have a SUPA policy or a metadata ID or an association class ID so that you have a unique ID in the top level of any inheritance tree to be able to name the instances so that we can talk about them with meaningful references consistently. So you don't have to go, the instance identifier is completely different if I talk about this than the one of those. They're tied together. We tried for consistency of structure here. I don't know if we fully succeeded, but we tried to help people understand how to read it. The information model has abstract classes and concrete classes. Now, somebody said, well, if you don't have to subclass the concrete classes, can you do this simpler thing? Well, there are simpler things you could do, but we need to subclass concrete classes too. So we have to handle both. So all classes are represented with groupings. Concrete classes are represented with a container, which holds a list, which is keyed by the relevant identity. So for every concrete class, there is a top level container, which is a list of the instances. Not the cleanest Yang I've ever had to work with, but it does work. And so the list definition is it's keyed by this, and then it says uses the grouping, and that's it. That's the full definition of the container. You don't need anything else in there. So we have associations. And so what we do for that is you have a leaf or a leaf list for the association pointer. That's fairly straightforward. That's what it is. It is itself an instance identifier. There were some folks who said, could you use the leaf refs instead? And maybe you could by then going, when you needed to get to everything else, working your way back up and back down. But we felt it was more general. You'd also have to change the container structure, and there were all sorts of problems because you have to know where you're pointing. But I can point at the parent class, the subclass, or the sub-subclass. So using the leaf refs didn't work for this, so we use instance identifiers. So it points to the list element of the container, which is where the concrete destination resides, because when it is resolved, any association has to point to an actual instance of a class, even if the type definition is pointing at an abstract class higher in the tree. So this allows you to point to various elements of a subclass saying, this thing associates to anything in this part of the tree, which is what associations normally say. And then at the moment, we're trying to get right a must clause, which identifies where in the tree it should be. This seems to be a Yang 1.1 construct, which we're having trouble getting through the Yang compiler, which means we don't quite know the magic incantation to tell Yang, this is what we mean, but I'm sure we can work it out with the Yang doctors and find the right way of saying, this referent must have an element which is this kind of ID, and its value must be this identity or something derived from this identity. Because I've been told that Yang can represent that, so we'll figure out the details. Right now, it doesn't go through the compiler because of those must clauses. But that's I originally wrote all of those as description clauses, and there were these long verbiages just to say that. One of the things we use in the model is a notion called an association class. This comes up in modeling when you say, I have this association and I have some properties related to it. So what you do is create another class, another abstract and concrete class pair, which you use to represent the instance of the association. So both ends, instead of pointing to each other, point to the guy in the middle who has the properties. And he points back to the two ends. and you name them in such a way that you know which end is which. And this is fairly standard and was fairly easy to do as simply creating additional classes in the Yang. So we have the data model derived from the IM. We'd like the working group to adopt this, and then let's in parallel fix the information model and the data model to say what we as a working group mean by the semantics of this work. Questions? Rotten tomatoes, something, please.
Yes, sorry, I'm from NetTracker. I have a question because, sorry, I did not read throughout. How do you represent the nested policy? If then in action, and I check if then.
So the representations of the properties of policy are captured in the information model.
Okay.
There are clauses. So in the ECA case, there is event clause, condition clause, and action clause.
Yes.
Each of those things is a class in the information model and is a class in the data model, and the associations which bind them together into a clause and then into a policy statement are all associations in the IM and associations in the DM. We do not do any containment because statements can be reused. This is the thing that made this challenging, is that much of Yang modeling relies heavily on containment. Because frankly, in most devices, when you're doing device config, containment is the natural way to look at these things. In this model, containment is not the natural way because things get reused and are separate and assembled. And so associations are the assembly technique. So in the Yang, it's represented as associations.
Okay, I take it off.
But you want to look at the information model to see how to do it.
Bert Weiner, thanks, Joel, for the presentation. I haven't seen the call for workgroup adoption in the mailing list, so.
It hasn't gone to the list yet.
Okay, so I didn't miss that. But I guess the document was announced on the mailing list, and I guess I missed that, or it was very recent. I would like to go.
It was delivered just before the deadline.
Okay. Because I want to review the document in a similar way I did the information model.
Please.
And you know, after that, I'm willing to make or to consider a position. But
Obviously, if people haven't had a chance to read it, then we're not going to have a discussion of is it good or bad. Because
exactly. That's what I mean. I cannot make it.
We did send to the list. I did write a note to the list saying, hey guys, here is the data model we derived from the information model. Please look at it.
Right, but if that was.
I also noticed that except for your comments, when we first sent the IM to the list, we said, here is the IM, guys, please look at it. And until Neville poked people, there wasn't much comment. I can't respond to silence.
No, I
understand.
I've been a working group chair. If you do a call to the working group, like this is your last chance to, you know, that helps. Thank you.
Just before we go further from there, can I ask, just wave your hands, if you've actually read this, I had a look at this draft. Okay, so there's about half a dozen, a little more.
A little more, but not a lot.
Okay, so we certainly need more people to take a careful look at it. And it's not necessarily the only Yang document that we may want to go on with, but it's a starting point. Andrew.
Andy Bierman, so I'm curious, is it your intent that this would be the SUPA solution? So if I'm going to be a user of SUPA, this is how I tell a SUPA implementation what to do?
This would be the generic Yang. I would expect there to be additional Yang models which augment this, or in many cases, derive new groupings using this to cover
So
more
the
specific
answer
cases.
is yes.
Yeah, this is
Okay.
going to be a part of the actual SUPA solution if we've done it right. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, well, so going on from there then, I think what I want to do in the next day or two is to set the data tracker flag to say, to put this one up for working group adoption. Can I just have a wave of hands to see how many people would be happy with that?
Good.
Okay, so there's about half a dozen there. And
That question seems like, are you asking whether we're okay if you ask for adoption, or did you want an answer?
I was actually asking, is it okay for me to ask that question?
Well, if I looked at how many people have read it and that the document was only posted like just before the deadline, then it seems, you should give people, at least I would like to review it. It's going to take me at least a week, I think, after today. And then, I will be fine to give you an answer as to whether I like it or not. That's not important whether I like it, but whether I would support adoption by the working group.
I think the way the process is supposed to work is I set the flag on the data tracker to say it's proposed for adoption. I wait for several weeks to see if I get some feedback. If I don't see people saying, no, let's not do that, and explaining why not, then I'll go ahead and move it to being a working group item. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ying. And I'll update the agenda as well to show that you're the presenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs. Hello, everyone. My name is Ying Cheng from China Unicom. I'm very glad to take this opportunity to represent applicability of SUPA to describe the process of this work item.
Ying, would you mind just talking either a little bit louder? I think some people are struggling.
Can you hear me? Is it okay? I think, okay. Thank you. Next page, please.
You have the power.
Repeat it. I need to
Press the button.
Just have to find the right.
Yeah.
this one.
Yep.
Wrong direction. Let me introduce the major point of this document. As you know that application of a SUPA document explores some typical use cases and demonstrated applicability of SUPA policy models defined in other corresponding document in SUPA working group. And as you know, this document come to the latest version 6. And I presented the table of content on the right of this slide. You can find we derived 5 typical real-world use cases, such as switched Ethernet services, virtual private cloud, and the traffic manipulation across data centers. That means the geographically distributed data centers. The next one is virtual service provider. The last one is instant VPN. So let me, I remember that this work item have been presented in the last meeting, and next page, I will present the summary of the progress of this work item from its creation to until right now. As you know, we have 6 major version changes. The major changes include to add clarification that interoperability is guaranteed at the generative data model level via the common concept, rather than at the domain-specific data model level. And to add text on the framework of a network management controller. To add a model snapshot and more description for examples, to improve other, include the received comments from the email list. And to next version, we improve the data model using script, and also a Python script example is given. I will present it very briefly in the next page. The next one is to add another data model example using Young argument and XML path. Next one is to improve data model using script, and also a Python script example is given. The last one, as you know, is the latest version. We improved the wording and modified the data table of content, as you've seen in the last slide. Next stage, I choose the switch Ethernet services as a data model example to describe the methodology we developed this work item. As you find on the left side, it is the SUPA data model snippet using XML. And on the right side, you can find the Python script capability model to be defined. Next page is the same use cases as an example using young argument. As you can find on the first one, we declare the argument using young model, and then we use of this argument. After finish the discussion, I will declare that we will make alignment with the mature information model and or data model developed in other ongoing internet draft of SUPA as described by other colleagues just now. And we would like to ask for adoption to the working group draft for this meeting. Thank you.
So no questions? Okay.
I guess one question is that.
Sorry, who are you, Will?
This is Will Liu from Huawei. Actually, I think one major question will be that given that we already have several examples in this document, and we have already write the details of how to use SUPA in those documents, but actually we need a major one, or we need for example, you are priority in these use cases, or instead of just listing too many use cases?
We will not cover everything in this work item, as you know, and we will choose the very typical use cases from the operators from China Unicom we deployed in real case to describe how to use SUPA policies defining other work items. Thank you.
I don't know if this is fully orthodox, but I was thinking whether it would be wise somehow to merge the three documents we have seen so far. I mean, we have an information model, we have a particular data model for that information model, and we have a set of examples of the applicability of the previous one. I don't know. It's simply because I have always loved the theories of the old Friar William about not having too many entities for anything, you know. So I don't know what Chong or Joel or you both think about that, but it's simply having a consistent single document describing the whole SUPA model, just as a suggestion.
And that was Diego Lopez, who forgot who he was.
Exactly, the one and only Diego Lopez. Sorry.
It's Friday. It's Friday. It's okay. At least you've got your pants on. So I had a quick question, and but I wanted to follow up on Diego's point there. So one of the benefits of breaking the work into the different documents is if someone says they're implementing a particular RFC, then clearly it's easier to show that you've implemented a particular piece of function, whether it's a data model or information model, and that's the separation is very important there. I do kind of concur, though, that perhaps we can look to combine some of the use case, some of the applicability. Maybe, though, the merging of the work could be in the architecture document, but this is, I should say this is as an individual contributor, not as a chair. If we could show how the architecture, how an information model is applied through a data model to a particular use case, that could be really interesting. I don't think I have anything to add to that. Okay, well, the next question then would be, with my chair hat back on, who's read this document?
So at this point, there seems to me to be quite a lot of material in this document, which doesn't necessarily have to be there. So I would like to see it being worked on the list, and until exactly which parts really ought to be where becomes a little more clear. So as chair, I don't think it's quite ready yet to be proposed as a working group document. It's not clear which parts of the charter it fits into. Would anybody like to comment on that? Okay, so we'll leave that one to go on with discussion on the list until we finally can see where the various parts ought to be.
Thank you, Ying. Thank you, Bert. Let's see.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Bert Wijnen. And since I had offered on the mailing list to take the lead on the architecture efforts, work, I made a couple of slides. And so let's go through them. Let's first see what the objective of this talk of these few slides is. It is not, we have seen a couple of documents, even like during this week, with proposed architectures and stuff. It's not to discuss any of those or to compare them to each other, because maybe we need even more time to do that. But I think it's much more important to get an agreement on the way forward. Like the question that was just raised with the last talk, like, I don't know how this fits in the system. I would hope that an architecture or a framework document would actually help us make much quicker decisions on whether a piece of work fits into the overall work we are trying to do. So that is my goal. So what I try to do is list, what has been done so far. I list a number of questions that have already been posted on the mailing list, some questions that I've heard offline, and these questions also need to be answered before you can actually decide. Actually, the working group needs to answer those questions before you can decide what the architecture or framework should look like. So I would like to suggest a couple of alternatives of an approach, how we can actually get an architecture or framework document done, hopefully fast. So the previous efforts that I have found, you see there are 4 internet drafts, all individual drafts. Earlier this week, so after the deadline, we had 2 other drafts posted to the mailing list and to the archive. I believe the first one from those of this week is a combination of some of the proposition documents up there. The one that has my initials in there is weak in completeness, so that is to be worked on if that would ever be considered. And there may also be others that that are in the works, maybe by various people. There may be others that I don't know of that I have not found. If you have any, it would be probably good to let me know, then that could be added to the list so we have a better overview of that. So here are some of the questions that have been raised. I'm not going to say whether they are valid questions, good questions, what the answers to these questions are, because that's something that the working group needs to decide. And the question is whether we can answer them those right now or not, but that's not the goal of my discussion. Just to get a feel of what kind of questions are being asked. So one of them is like, do we need to spend time on an information model? And if yes, should the UML be used to explain that, to form the information model? Do we plan to use that information model just to create a Yang data model? Is Yang our only target? Or do we expect another language, in the next couple of years, another data modeling language, the next couple of years, that would like to make use of the information model and define the data model in another language? And if none of these things, if it's just for a Yang data model, then one could wonder, and I think that question has also been raised, are we just generating the information model for theory, or, it's extra material we have to work on? Those are questions. I'm not giving answers. So other people have suggested that maybe it would be better to have a Yang policy language. So that would be a domain-specific Yang language that is particularly tailored to, ties directly into Yang. And then what people that have proposed this say is like, you would have the readers as a first priority, the readers of such a model, and the writers are second priority, because there are far less people who are going to write such a document, such a policy, than people that are going to read it. And those who have to implement it, those would be the last priority, because that would even be a smaller group. It's not to say that they're not important, but it's a smaller group that is easier to educate than a larger group. So the question where we need to find balance is the question about complexity. Some people say that, things are, maybe I even posted that in my posting on my information model review, that I said I find it far too complex. And I'm sure that, like, if you look at the document that has my initials in there on the architecture, that is far too simple. But we have to find the proper balance between simplicity and complexity, and that's something that needs to be worked out. And if we had a proper architecture document, then that might help us to decide, where we find the balance between these two. So who are the main users of the documents? That helps in defining, how much complexity or pre-assumed knowledge you assume when you write documents or when you define a language or whatever. You want to interrupt? That's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to comment on that's been the design goal of Yang, and I think from what I'm seeing so far, it's too complex across the board for readers, writers, and implementers. So I'm not saying I have a solution that's in scope that I can present, but I would really like to know who is implementing this, and are there implementations of this before we standardize it?
Well, right. And if we have a proper architecture or framework, that also helps to answer that question, I would hope. All right. So, so there may be other questions that I've not listed that I may have missed on the mailing list. There may be other questions that still come up, and those have to be, considered. So the big question is, what direction do we need to take, right? So this week we had a couple of get-togethers. I was at least in one of them. And there's no clear outcome yet of those discussions. I mean, they were sometimes heated as to what to do, and we tried to find solutions right there. But I think before finding a solution or an answer to which architecture to use, we better look like can we give whoever's going to do the architecture, can we give as a working group, can we give those people some guidelines as to which direction they should take? So we had a few people who have volunteered to work on this, but we need direction. I had volunteered to lead. That doesn't mean I must lead. Actually, I don't know whether it's the prerogative of the chairs or of the group to decide, which person is taking the lead, or maybe which group takes the lead or whatever. But, I've taken this action to prepare these slides at least. And certainly I cannot do this all by myself, and I doubt that, it would be wise to have any one single person to do this. So I wonder, would it be better to form a design team first and let them come up with an evaluation of each of the earlier efforts? So they could do, they could also do an evaluation of the questions that have been raised and the questions that are there. We may do an explicit call on the mailing list, like, are there more questions regarding the architecture or framework that we need to take into consideration? They could make a proposal about a direction first, instead of doing an architecture document, but more like a direction. This is the way we want to go in, like maybe say something about the complexity or simplicity that we want to achieve. Maybe say something about, yes, we only target the data modeling language of Yang, or no, we expect that there may be more languages in the future. So that's all things that we need to take into account then. Or maybe this design team creates a new architecture framework document, merged maybe from earlier efforts or whatever, and they present that to the working group. So anyways, if we do a design team, I would say, we need to set an aggressive deadline for them to come out with the work. Am I short on time or what? Am I okay? You're okay. Okay, thank you. So I suggest that that's a straw man there, like let's say 1 month before the IETF in 96, which would be, I think, the end of June. But if you say, like we want it to be by the end of May, that would mean they have a month and a half from now. That's up to the working group to decide as to how much time they want to give them. Anyway, so the alternatives, in my view, are that you create a design team with a task that says deliver one framework or architecture as a possible working group document. And then, of course, always design teams can make such a document, but still adoption by the working group is still a prerogative of the working group. So that it would come back to the working group as were it an individual document. You could also say we create a design team with a task to deliver 2 or more alternative framework documents. And, they would have to list the pros and cons of each approach. And the working group would evaluate the documents and the pros and cons of each. And the working group could even say, well, you list a pro here of some document, but, that has nothing to do with what we want to do in the working group. So that's a bogus pro. Or they could remove it, or they could add new pro and cons to each of the various approaches. So the whole thing is to explain again that the design team would come up with some sort of a starting document and a starting set of pros and cons of each approach that the working group can then discuss about and decide upon. You could even create a design team with other tasks like do evaluation of the earlier efforts, evaluate current and maybe new questions, make and prepare a proposal about the direction first, and then generate potentially a new draft that represents consensus of the design team members. And again, it would have to be, agreed by the working group. The other option that we have is that we just throw it out in the wild and anybody in the working group can submit their framework or architecture document. And then we have individual submissions from individuals or from small teams that self-form within the working group. But again, in order to make progress, we would have to set a deadline. So if you want to be considered with an architecture or a framework, you have to do it by a deadline. And again, I said, my straw man here is 1 month before IETF 96. And then the working group gets to evaluate all these drafts and maybe choose to have just one as a base, or maybe merge 1 or 2, or maybe merge 3, or if we have 15, maybe merge 10. I don't know how many we're going to get. Anyways, those are some alternatives. And basically, that's all I had to say. And I think I should give it to the working group chairs right now to see if they want to do some polls based on those suggestions, or whether they want to think about it first. I mean, I just gave some alternatives that people can think about.
Okay. Don't go away. You may want to answer some questions. So Bert's put up a long list of questions for people to think about. And he's raised the notion of a design team as compared to what we have now, which is a collection of existing drafts and authors who've been working on them. And he has pointed out that those authors have spent quite a bit of time together during the week. So the way I would see that is we already have a design team. It's the group of all of those authors. So can I ask, Bert, what do you think a team like that might achieve beyond what we have now?
I don't know. I mean, if you consider that a design team, then I guess that's your prerogative as chairs, and then you give us a task what we need to do, right? Because it seems like we certainly, when we had these discussions this week, we were not looking at an approach like this. We were looking, I think we were more maybe discussing the pros and cons of each other's approach, or maybe discussing how we could merge or whatever. And as I said, I don't know whether those are the only architectural framework documents in the works. If there are others, then we should probably consider those people as well. But maybe that's a question we can ask here if anyone else has a plan to contribute at that space, or who has already some documentation done for him or herself.
Okay. Well, the thing which which worries me about a design team approach is that these things spread out, in my experience, to solving much bigger problems than we actually have as set out in the SUPA Charter, which, I mean, it went through a couple of BOFs, and the Charter, as Joel Yeagley reminded us on the mailing list, has been very carefully framed to have a few what seemed like fairly simple deliverables. And so I'd like to try and keep the working group focused on meeting those charter deliverables. Once we get underway with that, then there is the possibility to spread out and do other things. But
No, I understand that, and I've been a working group chair myself, so you have to look at the deliverables. Isn't an architecture one of the deliverables? In any event, I would think that once you have an architecture, that a lot of the discussions that we are having, or that might be upcoming, could be solved by saying, well, we agreed on this architecture, so this is part of the work. Whether that part is in the current charter, so if we define something that's not in the current charter, as a design team or as a working group, then that's something that needs to be worked on later. As a matter of fact, that should be clear from the architecture that it is a component that can be decided and worked on at a later point in time. Otherwise, it would be stupid to go ahead and ignore it. If you already in the architecture or a framework document can see or explain that a particular component is needed, and if the charter does not allow that, then you would probably want to rediscuss the charter, I would think.
Yeah, okay. Well, so now I'll ask the room, can we have a wave of hands for people who are interested in working on an architecture? Well, there's 4 or 5 at least. Well, at this stage, I'm not prepared to get into something that looks like a formal design team. Can the people who are interested in that use the mailing list to swap ideas and move towards putting together a draft which you can agree would be a good overall architecture?
Did you get the names? Did somebody get the names? Because, I see a few hands, but there's also people that I don't know, so.
Wow.
We could.
What was?
I think Will said, we could ask people who want to participate, post to the mailing list, like, I'm willing to participate. And then based on that, we could self-formate a team, I guess.
Yeah, and that would be fine.
John Strassner. When I read the charter, and architecture is not specifically called out. In fact, it doesn't even occur in the charter, the word. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that we would have to recharter. When we worked on other documents, the value proposition, and even to an extent the applicability statement, these are all talking about a framework and how this would be used. I mean, in my humble opinion, the IETF is best at working bottom up, not top down. Architectures are top down. So for me, it's a little bit of a stretch to have a formal architecture document, but if the working group wants to, then let's go for it.
Well, so the term framework is probably better than architecture, but.
Andy Bierman, actually, I've asked this before, I think last time. I would like to see a useful example worked through. Show me, like Jürgen came up with the example of blocking SNMP. If that's not an ECA policy, fine. Come up with something dirt simple and show me how SUPA solves it. An example. I don't need a framework, an architecture, or not, but the Yang model that's been presented is not a single example in it. The info model, not a single example. So I'm having a hard time of seeing the solution. And if I get a framework that doesn't have any examples in it either, I don't think that'll help.
So just a clarification question. So the charter does specifically mention a framework, and then I believe it does mention.
That's what I thought.
Benoit Claes, right. So it says, an explanation of the scope of the policy-based management framework and how it relates to existing work of the IETF. Not sure who wrote that, but I think this is basically what you're talking about, right?
So I may have misused the term architecture, but I think that came up on the working group or something. So maybe it's better from now on to just talk about framework. That's fine.
John Strassner. These hardware things again. There are actually examples in the information model. Now maybe we should make them more detailed and more precise. There certainly should be examples in the data model. We just wanted to get the Yang out so that people could look at the Yang.
So going back to my earlier suggestion that people should say on the mailing list that they'd like to work on an architecture document. Clearly what I meant was the framework document, because that's part of our charter. So can we, well, yeah, exactly. Yes. So anybody?
Well, I'm a little confused since we have several candidate framework documents already. That have been worked on by other people. It's a little odd to say, do folks want to form a design team to do a new document from scratch rather than commenting on the existing document? And whether the existing document is right or not, that we've at least got one that it struck me as a reasonable starting point, and I would think it would seem a little odd to create a design team to see if we want to make a new one before giving feedback on what's right or wrong with the existing one. I mean, if the existing one is wrong, I'm sure the authors would be happy to participate in fixing it, but it would be good to know what the problems are so we actually fix the right thing.
Joe, one of my alternatives was that we have a design team that evaluates the questions against the existing drafts and comes with a list of pros and cons of each of those drafts. I mean, we don't necessarily have to write a new document, as far as I'm concerned. We need to give some handles for the working group to, discuss which way to go.
George Karagianis, Huawei. I think the approach that you mentioned regarding a design team that could compare the existing drafts is a good one. But the first question is to ask also the authors of the framework drafts to find out whether they would like to join the design team. And that's one point. The other point is related to your questions that you had. So I don't know if you want to go through a poll to find out whether we should, you had different options. We should go through each option to find out if the group wants to have to work on the existing framework drafts or to come up with new ones. So there are different options, no? So I don't know what the chairs would like to see.
Okay, so we've spent quite a lot of time kicking this around. I think Joel's comment that there is an existing framework document. If people want to suggest changes to it, then it's time to start sending text to the mailing list, pointing out how things can be improved so that we eventually converge or get some consensus on a usable framework document. And I think that's the best way for the group to move forward. So sorry to pour cold water on you, Bert, but at least you're making us think about it. Now, at this point, thank you, yes, we're out of time, but we did have one late request for a little more of the agenda. So you're welcome to leave if you'd like to, but we might as well listen to a short presentation of something completely different.
Thanks to chairs. I will present very quickly. This is Junbi from Tsinghua University and CERNET. We have co-authors from operators and vendors. They are also contributors in the BOF phase for several drafts. Basically, this draft describes the problem that SUPA will resolve and also discuss the related work inside and outside IETF. We believe that a good problem statement draft will be very helpful to SUPA. For example, if we have a typical use case in the problem statement draft, then have solution in the framework or data model drafts, eventually have the use case in the use case draft, then it will be very helpful for people to understand SUPA and help to the use of SUPA solutions. So today's network operation and management, they have many challenges. For example, the operation and management is very complicated. So it's very hard to deploy new policy or manage the existing services. Actually, today's operation and management framework is totally closed, so it's very hard to adopt new technologies.
Jim, sorry to interrupt you. If you're leaving the room, could you just ensure that you've signed the blue sheets? And if whoever has the blue sheets currently, could you just hold them up?
Okay, so with Super,
and has anyone not signed the blue sheet? Okay, if you can hand that towards the back, but that'd be great. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, so with Super, we have our unified framework, and we have the open interface based on the event, condition, action policies, and those data models. So it's very easy for the users to define the high-level policies and automatically enforce the policy. And eventually, we hope there will be a new policy layer to create an open ecosystem. So the policy layer will be between the high-level management authorization and those open network elements. We have several examples in the draft. Due to time limitation, I may just introduce one, the traffic management policy. So operators potentially can define the high-level event condition action policies. For example, the event could be the edge link close to being overloaded, and the condition could be if the link utilization exceeds like 80%, then the network will automatically do the action, change the routing configuration to other peers. The value of Super, first, it provides wonder and the technology independent policy framework. So it will simplify the deployment of new policy and the services. And the unified network infrastructure policy management. So operators can define the high-level network-wide policies, and how to configure the network will be totally automatic. And the third is real-time event-based network management. So with the Super policy defined and enforced, the infrastructure will automatically change based on the current conditions. It's totally automatically. So eventually we will have a new independent policy layer. It will help to create an open ecosystem. So next step, we hope people could review the document. It's already submitted, and feedback, comments, and we hope the working group can adopt this document eventually. Thank you.
Okay, so at this point, this document has actually been around for a while. Can you wave your hand if you've read it? Oh, okay. Well, fine. So at this stage, I think I would like to see a bit more progress on the information and data model drafts, which we've talked about at the start of the meeting. So I'd like to see the discussion on this one go on the list. So if you have comments to make, send them to the list. If you can put helpful improvement, send text to the list. It's just like every other working group. What's needed is useful contributions to the documents. So thank you for that. And now we're noticeably over our time, so thanks everybody for coming along to the session.
Can I add one word? Is that today we have several times of hands up for candidate, how many candidates have read it, but actually, you know, this is IETF meeting is located in here, and many people cannot be here actually in this, in this working group. They post an email, so I think only ask the people here is not, seems not fair, because we have many candidates on the mailing list and they are located anywhere else.
Well, okay. The way working groups are supposed to work is on the mailing list. That's where all of the decisions get finally made. So although the meetings are very useful to hear what people have been doing and talk about what we might do next, discussion on the list is where these things are made, and that's what we'll go on to do next. Right, everybody can go.
Must go, can go, may go.
Okay, the blue sheets are at the front, so if you haven't signed them, please just come and visit before you leave. Thanks, guys. Enjoy your trip home.
Raining outside, so it doesn't mean it's safe.
This afternoon or what? Yeah. Enjoy, and if I don't see you, safe travel. I'll see you hopefully in Berlin. Hopefully. Get in the Netherlands, let me know.